Okay, so welcome to the second in a series of counsellor research interviews. And my name is Dr. Nathan Beel, and I'm interviewing on behalf of the National Heads of Counselling and Psychotherapy Education. And today I have with me Dr. Denis O'Hara. And just wondering, Denis, if you'd mind introducing yourself to the viewers.
Hi, Nathan. Yes, I can say a couple of things. Well, obviously, Denis O'Hara. I'm currently program leader of the Master of Counselling program at the University of Queensland. And before that, was head of school and professor of counselling at Australian College of Applied Psychology, which is now called Australian College of Applied Professions. And before that at other universities. One of those was overseas in Scotland for some years. So I've been at lots of different places over a fairly long career now.
Yeah, so you've taught overseas, counselling overseas. You've also taught within a private institution and public university in Australia. So it sounds like you've got quite a diverse range of experiences there.
Yes, I think the different provider experience has been quite a rich one. So and added a lot of awareness of the different sorts of challenges in different settings.
Yeah, and also I'm mindful you've had some experience in PACFA before.
Yes, in terms of the associations and sort of I suppose a slightly wider stakeholder experience. So I was for some years on the board with PACFA, particularly because of my role as chair of the Professional Standards Committee. And so that was probably over about a 5-year period, I think. So that was a good experience too, because training is one thing, research is another thing, teaching's one thing, and then of course the whole industry perspective is its own field. It's in its own right. So I suppose I've probably looked at most angles and also been a practitioner as well. I've always been a practitioner, actually. I've always believed that if you're going to teach in the field, you should maintain practice and relevance. So a few balls in the air at once.
Excellent. So your perspectives will certainly there's a whole richness behind your perspectives, and I'm sure the viewers will find this interview very interesting. So I'm just wondering, Denis, if I'm curious as your own journey of research, like did you start out wanting to become a counselling researcher, or how did you get there to where you are now?
Yeah, it's an interesting question and an interesting journey, I think. I suppose if you would have asked me, 30 plus years ago, would I have been, doing a lot of research, I probably would have said no. I've always been interested in sort of theory and academics, but I've always also been interested in practice. So it's always been an interesting tussle for me to say, well, I like to do a bit of this and I like to do a bit of that. And so I was doing a fair bit of practice, also teaching as well. It was one of those things where it just seemed the obvious next thing to do, I suppose. And it just became obvious at one point that, well, I really should do a PhD. And it wasn't because I was forced to. I was just interested. I found it, stimulating, and I had ideas I wanted to pursue. And so it seemed a rather natural next step. And then, of course, once you're doing a PhD, you're automatically doing research. And then once you're learning about research and doing research, you end up doing more research. So it gave me the tools then and an understanding of how to go about the practice and process of research. And so then it just continued from there, really.
Okay. And how did you get into your PhD program?
Well, this is over 25 years ago. And there weren't many PhD programs in counselling in Australia. So I actually thought about maybe I'll go overseas and was open to that idea. I think the thing that convinced me in the end was that we get scholarships to do PhDs in Australia, and they're very expensive overseas. So I stayed in Australia. But what I was trying to do is look for somebody. I already had an idea about the topic, and I think that's very important. You have to already have a bit of a direction and a bit of a passion for an idea. So I was then looking for somebody who might make sense of that, would like the idea and also have the background, and certainly from a research point of view, but also from a content perspective as much as possible, who could supervise me in that process. And at the time, I was fairly fortunate that one of the few places that were offering PhDs that particularly were related to counselling was the University of New England. So I inquired, they were interested, and I went from there.
Okay, yeah. And what, in terms of your research preparation prior to your PhD, what was your research preparation like prior?
I had done a master's degree and also a graduate diploma in counselling as well. My master's degree was in educational, and particularly educational psychology. That was the angle. And it had a research component. So I had already done some research and produced a mini thesis, basically. So I didn't come into research completely new, although I was still very much a beginner, really. But the experience of doing research in my master's certainly whetted the appetite and gave me a little bit of confidence. I think that was the other aspect. I think if you'd asked me in my undergraduate, I was sort of, 40 years ago, will you do a PhD? I would have laughed and said, no, don't be silly. But it was almost like each step gave me more information, more knowledge, and more confidence. I think confidence is quite an important factor here. It just gave me a bit more, maybe it's possible I could do that. I'm not sure, but maybe.
Yeah. So so not just simply learning about the theory, but actually doing some research, starting out with some research and seeing that you can do it.
Yeah, that really helped a lot.
Yeah. And just curious as to your research interests, so either in your PhD or what you're doing now, or what are some of the topics you've researched?
I've got a few key areas, but I've also had a bit of breadth as well. Probably my most dominant area is hope studies, so hope in counselling and psychotherapy. But that it also links with some other areas in a way, certainly trauma these days, and the challenges of self, the difficulties in self. So, problems of the self, if you like, which can take you in a range of different directions, but obviously they're all related to well-being and, maybe some psychopathology, if we want to use that language. So one of the first areas I actually did research in post-PhD actually was the differentiation of self, which is family systems perspective, Bowen's theory. So I wanted to delve into that and had some other ideas. So that was quite good fun. But my actual PhD topic was psychotherapy integration. So I've always had an interest in psychotherapy integration. So that's been another fairly strong research stream. So those two areas got me going. And then I suppose I was doing a lot of my early research when the common factors material or findings really came to the fore. And, one of the common factors, of course, is hope and expectancy. And I was quite intrigued by that. And then, so I really pursued that. So I've done quite a lot of research in that, and I've written a book on it and book chapters and articles and so on. So that's been an interesting area. That continues, and I have students that want to do PhDs related to that because they see the material and so on. But also one other area, which is sort of quite a different area to the others, which are more about the practice and the processes of therapy, is the professionalisation of counselling and psychotherapy in Australia. So, how do we position ourselves? How do we think about ourselves? That type of thing has also been an interest for me as well. So I've written a reasonable amount on that.
Yeah, and this is quite a topical issue at the moment with Australian counselling, with the upcoming government training, minimum training standards coming in. So I imagine that may have relit your interest again.
Yeah, so I sort of thought, well, I better, I've written a fair bit on that over the years, but I better polish that up a bit as well. So I've written some more recently on that.
Yeah. And these research topics that you've actually researched over time, are these things which you just felt, interested in and that you just wanted to pursue, or?
Yes, I mean, that's tended to be the way it's happened for me. It's not necessarily the classic way. I mean, most of us try and pursue something we're interested in. We don't do it just for the heck of it. But there is also pressure within academia to, I suppose, in the purest sense, to find an area and stick with it, and that's your area for life almost, or at least something close to it. Because that way you get multiple publications, you get known, you get, citations, etc.
Yeah.
And that's a really good thing to do. But that wasn't quite the way it emerged for me. I tended to go, well, what am I interested in now? Also, what's needed now, in a way too. Hence the professionalisation of counselling discussion. But I've always believed that I struggle to write unless I'm interested. So
sure. It helps with the motivation.
I need the motivation. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm just curious around your thoughts around research and counselling, and what do you think the place of research and counselling is, and what degree of importance would you claim it to have?
Yeah. I mean, there's always that classic divide, isn't there, between researching or researchers and practitioners. And in some ways, never the twain shall meet, sort of thing. And of course, I've always tried to do both. So I think the big issue is relevance, and I think you can research in a very purist way that's deals with some pretty interesting ideas, but there's no guarantee it's going to come back to earth and make a difference. And I think in our field, it's all about making a difference. It's all about helping people and affecting people's lives in a positive way. So I think counselling research has really got to have always a foot grounded in practice somehow or other, even if it's got a more theoretical dimension to it. It's got to say, well, yeah, that's great, but so what? So I've always been interested in the so what. But I personality-wise, I'm quite happy to stay with theory and sort of have interesting ideas in my head. So that can be fun, but in the end, I have to say, well, why am I doing this? So I think that says a fair bit about research. Really, if it's going to be really worthwhile, especially in our field, it has to impact the profession, it has to impact people's lives. I think I think there is a place in some disciplines for really rarefied sort of theoretical research that you never know where it might spin off to, so there is a place for that, but I just don't think that's so much in our sphere. So research should add value to practice in the end. Now, that could be in quite a wide space. So it might be just in the organisation of the profession. That's a worthwhile exercise.
Yeah.
But it might also be in helping someone recover from trauma. I mean, those things look very, very different, but they're all still having some type of relatively direct impact on people's lives eventually.
Yeah.
And so I think the other part of the importance of research, and it's just the way that our society is structured, you're not really a profession unless you've got a body of knowledge.
Mhm.
Okay, now that's been tricky for us in the counselling field because we're actually quite an interdisciplinary profession in a certain sense.
Yeah.
In that we draw on knowledge from a range of places. So we draw on a bit of philosophy. We certainly draw on developmental theories. That's very important for us. We draw on various elements within psychology. We draw on some sociology. We might even draw on some pastoral care, and even other places like career development, marriage and family, relationships. So we draw on a lot of existing and continuing, semi-separate, you might say, fields of research and disciplines. But so what I think has been very important for us, the discipline, to say, well, why are we even here? Why don't we just be that or this or that, Yeah. And my argument has always been, I've written on this, that what makes this a profession, and in a sense a discipline, is the way we pull all of that together. So it's the way that we integrate, and there's that interesting word, it's how we integrate knowledge from different places in a particular way that then we say this is our foundational core knowledge platform. And now that's all well and good for me just to say that. But if nobody else knows about it, then what's the point? And that's where research comes in. So we have to sort of demonstrate that. We have to write to that. And this is where writing, I think, is very powerful, that you can think about it, you can talk about it in a group, all of which is a very good thing to do. But when you write it down, it sort of exists. Yeah. And people can then see it. Yeah. And then that stimulates further discussion, and it helps the identifying and the identity of an entity, in this case, our profession. So I think I've always said to students and others and counsellors and so on, when in doubt, write something, because if you can get it out there, it then becomes a point of reference. Even if you disagree with it, it's still helpful because it's a point of reference. So I think research is hugely important to firstly establish the profession and therefore give it a sense of bona fides, so that others go, oh, okay, you guys actually know what you're talking about. The government can see it and recognise it as well. And actually that the counsellors feel good about themselves, that, oh, that's us. I've got that. I want that hat.
Sure. So it can both help at an individual level in terms of, I guess, getting that credibility, reputation out there, as well as at the profession level, that when we've got more people doing that, then we're seen as, okay, this is actually a legitimate profession with academics or researchers who are publishing stuff, which is of note. As well as I'm also hearing almost it creates a history for us as well, a documented history of ideas and developing ideas and discussion. And
yes, I think that's a good point. That having a history is quite important.
Yeah. And part of it also is you're sort of saying publish it, get it out there. And this, I guess, is one of the struggles at times, if for academics who are watching this, is the struggles to get our research recognized, cited, visible enough to the world. So that's have you sort of thought about any strategies that you use in terms of getting it out there in the public sphere or promoting it, the awareness around it? Or
so excuse me. So meaning in terms of the fact that you might have written something, but how do you disseminate?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a few avenues there. Obviously, probably the quickest way to get something out there, apart from local newsletters or something like that, and there's a place for that as well, is in journals. When I say the fastest, that doesn't feel very fast when you're doing it, but relative to other vehicles, It's probably one of the fastest. So writing for journals is very important. Book writing, or whether that's a standalone book or chapters and books. Chapters and books can be very, very good. Speaking at conferences, so I've done a lot of conference speaking, and that's good for lots of reasons. One is you're getting the message out there, but you're also rubbing shoulders, hearing what others got to say. You're collaborating. You're sharing knowledge together. So all of those avenues are really, really important. I wouldn't say just one. I'd say all of those are really important.
Yeah, for sure. I'm just wondering, in terms of advice for students or researchers or profession, like what sort of advice would you give in terms of how to help generate or create research capacity, or to help students on that research journey, if they are sort of interested in one of the journeys?
Yeah, I think well, firstly, you've got to have a bit of a sense of a topic, an area of interest. But I do think then, to help you get going on that, you really need a supervisor. Now, that can be tricky for I think probably two main reasons. One is there anyone around that's got a similar interest, or at least has got the capacity to support you in your particular interests? Now, whether that be content-wise or methodologically, you need somebody who's got some background that's going to sort of match with that. That's not necessarily that easy to find in Australia because we're so spread out. But having said that, there's still people around, and and with the advent of sort of the online and Zoom and all of that, that's a bit easier than it ever used to be. I think the other thing is finding a supervisor who not only has a good match in terms of knowledge, but actually that you can work with. So, horses for courses. So, some supervisors are a really good match for you and a really good match for somebody else, but not necessarily always a match for you. And I would advise prospective, beginners in research to really keep searching until you find someone that sort of you feel comfortable with, has got the knowledge to support you. But you've got to risk a bit. Research is a bit, by its very nature, is risky, because you might have a fantastic idea. You go and get the data, and the data doesn't corroborate what you thought it might say.
Yeah.
It's still a finding, but just not the one you're hoping for. So it's always a risk. And it's a risk to go and knock on someone's door and say, look, I'm interested in this. Would you be interested in that topic too and helping me out? But it's also a very rewarding, fun journey too, in many respects. When you're doing it, I mean, you're doing the really hard yards in terms of all the writing and the data collection and all of that. That's the researcher. But the supervisor is invested too, and they're really interested, and you're having fantastic conversations. So it can be really quite a fun exercise. Yeah.
And in terms of, say, students who you'd be looking at and taking on board, because obviously it's important to find the right students as well, and not all students will be able to succeed in that journey.
Right.
So what sort of student would you be looking for if you're sort of wanting someone to come and approach you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. A few things. Sometimes students have fantastic ideas, but they're too fantastic. And so you need someone who's done a fair bit of thinking and reading already. So I don't want someone to come up to me and say, I've got this idea, and how much have you read on it? Oh, not much, but it's a good idea. I'd say no pretty much straight away.
Right.
So I want to know that they've really done a fair bit of groundwork already, and that I don't expect them to have the topic completely developed. That takes quite some time, but at least the general heading with good reading already And I'm convinced that they have done a fair bit, even at that early stage. That would be encouraging from my perspective. I think the other thing that I'll be assessing is their capacity to work fairly independently. So research is very different from coursework, incredibly different, because coursework's got amazing structure. You've got deadlines, you got to produce, and you get lots of articles given to you, and you get videos and all sorts of things. Research is not like that. Research assumes that you're already self-directed, that you're independent in your work, and that you ask for advice when you need it. Also, along with that, I'd want someone who is open to feedback. So if you've got fantastic ideas, but you don't want to hear anything other than that, then that's not a good match either.
Yeah.
So you need to be, this is the whole idea of supervision. You need to be directed as well as supported. So someone who can sort of receive maybe some difficult feedback at times, but is willing to learn and really put in the effort. So it's a big effort. Someone who can work in spits and spats as well, because that's the nature of research as well. So there are very intensive periods, and there are periods that are sort of pretty quiet, and because you're waiting for things that you can't do much about, but you still got to be ticking away on ideas. So someone who needs miles and miles of support, is too much, and that's not what you want in a student researcher.
Yeah.
Some support, of course, but if they're overly dependent, then they're asking me to do all the work, and it's not my project. I'm supporting the project.
Yeah, absolutely. And also with busy academics as well, we've got plenty of other things we're having to attend to, and
that's right.
Can't afford to be stalled by student neediness.
No, it's the academic life is a very busy one. Yeah.
Okay, and in terms of prerequisites, would you require a research master's or an honours completion prior, or what's sort of your minimum?
Part of that, the answer to that is also a bit to do with the institution you're in. They vary a bit. You would think they'd be fairly standardised, but in the end, it doesn't quite work that way. I think a general rule would be, well, it depends on what it is. If it's I'd put sort of three type of levels, I suppose. The honours is a very good beginning point. Maybe something slightly similar to that, but slightly less, but in the same degree, is the coursework masters that's got a research bit to it, where you might actually collect a bit of data, maybe not a lot, but a little bit.
Yeah.
That one there, I'm not expecting them to bring a lot other than a research methods course, because they're just getting going, and that's fair enough. If you're talking about what we generally refer to as high degree research or HDR research, you're generally speaking about something like an MPhil, or sometimes they call them a Masters by Research, but that's a similar thing. And then, of course, you could have a professional doctorate or a PhD. Those ones, usually the university would expect something like about 4 courses, at least 3, in research that's produced something already.
Right.
It'll vary a little bit. Some places are very, very strict about it, and will require at least 4, with an existing dissertation before you get in, which does seem a little bit rough, because you're still only just beginning, really.
Yeah.
I suppose the bottom line is they're just wanting to see, have you got any evidence to prove that you can actually do a bit of research?
Yeah.
That's the bottom line, really.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
So have you evidence that you have capacity and ability to be able to succeed and complete the PhD?
that's it. That's
If
it.
there's no indicators, if they're just making promises with no actual
Yeah,
evidence behind it, it's
that's it.
much more high risk. Yeah.
Yeah, it's gotten a lot tougher these days. They want to see a bit of evidence.
Yeah.
So,
And maybe
but although you can slice and dice that in terms of getting yourself ready, in that even if you've done a coursework master's, although you would need to have done at least the research methods, you might have produced a couple of articles.
yeah,
They'll look favorably on that. They'll sort of say, "Oh, well, you're demonstrating that you can write, and you're demonstrating you're doing something here, so we might consider you."
there's some runs on the board.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you have anything else to add before we sort of wrap up today? Any other comments about anything that you think might be helpful or like to say?
Yeah, I mean, the only other thought is, and this depends a little bit on the institution. In some of the bigger universities, research is a bit linked to grants and things like that. It's always nice if you can get one. It's very difficult to get grants in counselling because the granting bodies tend to go with sort of medicalised type topics more than the social type topics. But some people get into a research program because there's a grant available. So that's just another thought. But generally speaking, that's probably not so much the case in counselling, and you can get off the ground without having to worry about that too much. You might worry about that later on. The only other thing I would say apart from that is I'd strongly encourage those who've got some inclination towards research and, wanting to explore ideas further is please pursue it, or at least explore the idea and the possibility, because we really need more researchers in the field in Australia. In places like America, there's a very big population, so there's enough of them to sort of generate that type of research. The UK is doing pretty well, but our population's sort of starting to get there, but we're still a bit small relative to the discipline within the whole. So I would strongly encourage, if you're interested, we'd love to see you adding to the discipline and making a contribution.
So maybe would that involve steps such as if you're studying a student at the moment, talking to your program discipline lead or staff?
Yeah, definitely. I think you've got to start the conversation and just get a feel for it and see what's possible, if they like the ideas, those sorts of things. I suppose the other thought we haven't raised is how relevant is it for you in terms of where you want to end up in your career? I started off by saying I hadn't even thought about it really. It just sort of emerged. But for some others, they might have a clearer view of, I want to end up maybe teaching at a university, for example, or I want to stay closer to practice, but I want to be head of a clinic where I'm, maybe have a doctorate and I can, I'm really informed and take that clinic in a direction. Have a little bit of a sense of where you'd like to end up in 10 or so years' time is something worth considering as well, because higher degrees, of course, do tend to open doors. One of the reasons I was able to work in the UK was because I had a PhD. I wouldn't have gotten in without my PhD. So it does open doors if that's the right doorway for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially if you're wanting to get into academia, it makes you that much more competitive against other applicants when you have a PhD or are a good way through a PhD journey.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, look, thanks very much, Denis. I really appreciate the ideas and the wisdom and your openness to be able to share your experience and your journey. And hopefully that'll help inspire students who might be watching this, or academics who haven't yet started the PhD journey, but are sort of thinking, how do I get started and what do I do now? So yeah, really appreciate your time, and thanks for being willing to have this conversation.
Well, yeah, you're very welcome. Thanks, Nathan.